right, so let's talk about filtration. So filtration happens in the renal corpuscle. In our body, we have about 3 liters of blood. And in a 24-hour period, we filter about 180 liters into Bowman's capsule. That's a lot. So how does that happen? So let's look at our corpuscle. Let's put our little glomerulus in here. Okay. Actually, I'm going to erase that because I might need that. But just know that the capillaries are in there. So that's the glomerulus. Okay. All right, so the glomerulus is just a capillary bed. Okay, so what happens at the capillary bed? Well, let's look at like a regular capillary bed for a second. So we should remember this when we looked at vessels. Okay, we have a part where blood enters the capillary bed and then where blood leaves the capillary bed. So the blood is entering the capillary bed, obviously from an arteriole, and it is at some amount of pressure, right? Basically, blood pressure. We call it hydrostatic pressure. And that hydrostatic pressure that comes in is putting pressure on the walls of the capillary. And that pushes out fluid, you remember. And as it goes down the capillary bed, the hydrostatic pressure decreases. Okay, so it starts at about 32 millimeters per mercury, and then it ends at about 15 millimeters per mercury. And so it pushes out fluid. We called that bulk flow. So this was bulk flow. So it pushed out fluid and then whatever kind of went with it, type of thing. And that's a type of filtration. It's not specific. It's just a bunch of fluid coming out and then whatever's in there with it. And then we talked about there was a pressure that went against that in the opposite direction. And this was due to the plasma proteins. And that created an osmotic pressure, and it's called colloid. Osmotic pressure. And that was about 30. And it doesn't change because the proteins are just all in the blood, so it doesn't get less as it goes down the capillary bed. It stays the same. So with the fluid coming back into the capillary because of colloid osmotic pressure, countering the hydrostatic pressure where it's pushing out the bulk flow, we end up with a net filtration here of about 3 liters. And if you remember, we had the lymphatics that were in there to sop that up. Okay, so in the corpuscle, we know that blood is entering through the afferent arteriole. Okay, so it's entering in, and it's a hydrostatic pressure. It's basically blood pressure, and that pushes stuff out. Okay, so there's that 32 millimeters of mercury of hydrostatic pressure. Okay, again, this is just blood, so we also have a colloid osmotic pressure. So there's that 30 millimeters per mercury of colloid osmotic pressure that's going in the opposite direction. Now the 32 doesn't really reduce because these capillaries are not in a long line. We know that when the longer the capillary that is in a line, the more it's going to feel resistance, and then that pressure is going to go down. But in the glomerulus, the capillaries are in a knot. They're not in a straight line. So it doesn't really reduce from the 32 millimeters per mercury. All right, so is there any other pressure there? Well, there actually is. There is a pressure coming from the capsule because there's fluid in the capsule. And it creates a pressure on the walls of the capsule. So that's about 15 millimeters per mercury. Okay, so this is from fluid in the capsule. Okay, so there's a pressure there. So just looking at this, we've got more really going into the glomerulus than coming out. So that doesn't make for a very efficient filtration. It makes for basically no filtration. So if you look at the structure of the afferent arteriole compared to the efferent arteriole, the efferent arteriole is smaller. The afferent arteriole is larger, and of course it's wrapped in smooth muscle. So that means more blood is coming into the glomerulus than is able to leave. It's coming in faster than it's able to leave. It doesn't leave at that speed. So that in itself causes a pressure because more is coming in and is having trouble getting out. Okay? So that pressure is about, so from the afferent arteriole due to its size is about 23 millimeters per mercury of mercury. Okay, so that allows for more stuff to enter the capsule than to go back into the capillaries there. And it's about the total amount. So the total amount to go into the filtrate is about 10 millimeters per mercury pressure that gets it in there. Okay, so that is basically the glomerular filtration rate, or GFR. Glomerular filtration rate. Okay, so GFR is important. Okay, and glomerular filtration rate. So I'll show you what that is. So glomerular filtration rate, if we look at it. So if we have GFR on one side of this little graph and MAP over here, so mean arterial pressure. Okay, so the mean arterial pressure ranges. So if we go from, so this range from 80 to 180 mean arterial pressure. The average filtration rate, we said, is about 180 liters, okay? And the kidneys can keep this steady between 80 and 180. All right? If we get below 80, glomerular filtration rate goes down. If we get above 180, glomerular filtration goes up. But there is no change from here to here. It can keep that 180, that glomerular filtration rate, steady within that huge range there. So how does it do that? There are mechanisms that allow for this to happen. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about in the next video.